welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I am your host, John Viscardo. And with me today is the great Kris Thompson, joining us all the way from Reno, Nevada. Hello, Kris.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
For those of you who don't know, our episode today is on Creighton Abrams. And before we get into it, can you kind of give your background in the military, Kris?
Yes, sir. So I'm a retired full colonel, United States Army. About half my career was active duty and about half in the Army National Guard. I've commanded units from platoon through regimental level. I've gone to all the Army service schools, including the Senior Service School of the U.S. Army War College. I worked for John Abrams, who's the son of Creighton Abrams, and more about him later. I know the daughter, and I've met the other two sons, and I have so much respect for them. So This is a personal topic.
I'm super excited to get into it. Great Creighton Williams Abrams was born on September 15th, 1914 in Springfield, Mass., into a military-minded family with strong discipline and work ethic. What do we know of his childhood?
So he grew up in a village outside of Springfield called Agawam, and his father was a mechanic on a short line rail between Boston and Albany, New York. It was a very tight-knit family. The mother also was employed as an estate caretaker on a local estate. And so from the biographies and the information, you get the feeling that this is a very kind of a hard-working family. All the kids had part-time jobs, very tight-knit. They grew up in their junior high and high school years, kind of in the midst of the Great Depression. So hard work was the word of the day in that household, I believe.
Yeah. As you mentioned, he was the son of Creighton Williams Abrams Sr. and Nellie Abrams, and they kind of grew up, like you said, Great Depression time frame. What do we know about Creighton Jr.'s personality?
So he wasn't afraid to be different. He sometimes would wear kind of a blue serge suit to school when others were wearing sweaters. He was the oldest of the kids in the family. And this is amazing. So his high school record, he was class president, editor of the class paper, class orator, president of the honorary society, and captain of the championship football team for Western Massachusetts that went undefeated and unscored upon for an entire season, while averaging 26 points a game. So he was a natural-born leader, from the get-go. He had a great sense of humor. He's well known for that. And just reading between the lines and what he did in high school, he must have had a very high energy level and been a very busy guy day in and day out.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty good resume just in high school. From there, in 1932, he receives appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He participates in athletics and develops a reputation for determination and strong leadership skills. I've always wanted to figure this out at West Point. How does a cadet stand out there when everyone is trying to be a leader?
So it's a great point. I'm not a West Pointer, but I've commanded West Point officers and I've worked for West Point officers on active duty. And, the thing people have to realize is just getting into West Point is so competitive. So you have all the 18-year-olds, high school seniors out there, and it takes the very best to even go to your Congress member or your senator for entry. And in Abrams' case, he got a scholarship at Brown University, but he couldn't go there because the family couldn't afford it, even with the scholarship. So he went to his local congressman, and there were three other competitors at the time, and he scored the worst on the congressman's internal test. But then the other two competitors failed the West Point entrance exam, and he passed it. So just getting into West Point, it was kind of the stars aligned for him. And I talked to a buddy of mine who I talk to weekly, and who's a West Pointer. and he told me that, you can see the it factor in these guys at West Point, and women and men. And the cadets run their own units at West Point as they progress through the program, and it kind of carries over whether they go to military or to the civilian life. And Abrams graduated from West Point in the lower third of the class, kind of like a Grant. And there are some similarities, I think, early on between Ulysses S. Grant when you read about his campaigns and kind of how he kind of adapted tactics and in kind of an unknown environment with not a lot of doctrine out there. And you see a lot of the same thing with Creighton Abrams early in his career, where he was adapting tactics with new forms of warfare. There really wasn't a lot of accepted doctrine. And so you had to think practically about what works. But even in the lower third of the class, by the time you're good enough to apply, good enough to get appointment, good enough to get into West Point, even the lower third of the class at West Point is the top 0.1 of 0.1 of 1% of potential military leaders in the U.S. And the rankings at West Point were, at that point in time, were based on GPA and based on peer rankings and physical fitness.
Yeah, and I like that you call out the it factor, which is hard to describe, but it's like, do people gravitate towards them? Do they do the jobs nobody else wants to do? Do they help their superior commander? Like it's a whole bunch of little things.
Yeah, exactly. And Abrams fills the bill. He's that high school leader, class president, the center and captain of a football team, and that just naturally progresses into West Point, where they, they hone those leadership skills. And the great thing about West Pointers that I always found on active duty, and Abrams fits the mold perfectly, is West Pointers, when they show up at a unit, they hit the ground running. I mean, they spent 4 years in a very regimented military program. They spent their summers in the field with active duty. They are ready to rock as a second lieutenant, when they get there.
Yeah.
And I think for a guy like Abrams, when he reports to his first units, that kind of constant leadership training really paid off.
Yeah, he graduates from West Point in 1936, commissioned second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. What was his first posting?
So he went to the famous 7th Cavalry, and the Custer's old unit, and it was in Fort Bliss, Texas. And so keep in mind, 1936, he is still horse cavalry. They still are a horse cavalry regiment. Keeping in mind, the year before, 1935, Germany formed and equipped its first Panzer Division. So this is how far behind we are. There was a great incident that says a lot about Abrams' command style. When you talk about art of command, Abrams was well known for getting his commanders and his NCOs, non-commissioned officers, around and pointing out what somebody did wrong or somebody did right and what to learn from it. And one of the best anecdotes from this period of time when he was this platoon leader in 7th Cav is one of the first things you do is you take supplies on your horses. And every cav trooper has a lead pulling 2 horses filled with ammo or supplies behind him. And you go out in the desert. And so this one trooper in Abrams' platoon, he went one way on a sand dune. His 2 cargo horses went the other way, pulled him off the horse, dragged him through mesquite and cactus. So Abrams got the platoon together, and the kid thought, Private Sanborn was his name. The kid thought, I'm in for it now. He's going to rip me. But Abrams, true to his form about good humor, that he called out the trooper and he said, Private Sanborn pulled off his horse, wasn't properly leading him. Key point is, men, he didn't let go of his horses. And so Sanborn says, here I was, I had mesquite and cactus thorns in my backside, but I felt like $1,000 after Abrams complimented me for not giving the horse. Another incident that occurred that really affected Creighton Abrams was after a successful tour as a platoon leader, he was put in charge of the commanding general's mess for the cavalry division. And this general was very full of himself. And he always had this big mess with white linen and silver and china. And Abrams had to send runners out to get special forms of salmon. And that really did not sit well with Creighton Abrams. He didn't like the officious nature of this general and kind of the arrogance of it and the difference between himself and the treatment of the soldiers. And I think you see he loved to be with the troopers and with his soldiers, from that point forward.
Yeah, I'm starting to see why Patton liked this guy. Patton liked to intermix with the soldiers as well. So during the late 1930s, he trained in emerging armored warfare concepts that would soon become important in modern combat. We often hear Patton was one of the first to recognize tank warfare's importance. Was Abrams one of the first as well?
He was indeed. It is kind of surprising. I mean, he kind of got into West Point lining up the stars, comes from a somewhat hard scrabble upbringing. You would think he'd kind of go with the flow and be an establishment kind of guy. But early on, when they were forming the armored divisions, 1938, 1939, Abrams was one of the first to volunteer. And he was warned by senior officers in the horse cavalry, dude, if you do this, you are writing yourself off for future promotion. And nobody's quite sure if armor is going to be the way to go. I mean, this is, as of 1938, Creighton Abrams was still at the horse cavalry unit. Guderian published Achtung Panzer, which is the Blitzkrieg Bible the year before.
Armor's still a relatively new technology, right?
It is. And even though there were tanks in World War I, they were really not tanks as we know them today. But his wife said, what his wife's quote was, he didn't want to be caught short in the horse cavalry because he knew that armor was the thing coming. And that shows a lot of foresight on his part. And the interesting part is when he got to this kind of startup armor division, they still had horsemanship on the officer evaluation forms, right? So his first eval in the armor division was horsemanship unknown, horsemastership unknown, mechanization excellent. And so, but this shows again a willing to think outside the box, a willing to innovate. He's not tied to dogma, which I think really comes to full fruition later in his career.
Yeah, there's a great quote from Patton that says, quote, "I'm supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have one peer, Abrams. He's the world champion," end quote.
Yeah, and Abrams, he was, from that point in time in the late 30s and early 40s, you have to keep in mind, we really didn't have field manuals. We really hadn't studied armored warfare at a major level. We had no corps maneuvers, no division maneuvers. But Abrams was in at the ground floor, kind of in the same unit. And he was a hardcore trainer in the field. And so out of all the American officers, maybe besides Patton and maybe Adna Chaffee, Abrams was one of that initial core group. And just to show, how far behind, we were, the first M4 tank wasn't fielded until September 42. Whereas the first Tiger tank was fielded the month before. And that first Sherman tank, of course, was a 75, thinly armored. And the Tiger was the epitome of the heavy tank technology. It just shows how far behind we were and what Abrams had to do to try to get caught up with his unit.
Well, that does kind of lead me into my next question. He transfers to armored units within the 1st Armored Division. Why was the Army expanding tank forces during peacetime?
Yeah, they saw in 1939, you saw the armored blitzkrieg in Poland. 1940, you saw the blitzkrieg in France. And even though the president, Roosevelt, running for re-election in 1940, promised we would not be involved in a European war, I think that time frame after the defeat of France, 1940 to 1942, all of a sudden the factories get engaged. The tank technology starts ginning up here, because at that point it was clear that Germany was a major threat to global stability and a major threat to the global economy. And so we really had a lot of ground to make up with, technology-wise, training-wise, personnel-wise. We went from about 160,000 of an army up to 1.8 million within 24 months.
Right.
So a lot of work to do on our end for that.
Also in 1936, he marries Julia Bertha Harvey, who later became well known for supporting soldiers' families during Abrams's career. What do we know of his personal life?
So quite remarkable, like everything is with this man. Creighton Abrams had 6 children, 3 girls, 3 boys. I believe he is the only general officer ever in the history of the United States to have 3 sons, all of whom became general officers. And I think he is the only man in the history of the U.S., only 4-star general, to have 2 sons that also made 4-star general. John, who I worked for, and then a son, Robert. And the family, it is quite amazing. All 3 sons devoted their adult lives to the Army, obviously. And the daughter, Jean, I actually served on the same post as Jean and John when I worked for John. Jean was a doctor. She had married a armored cav officer who was on our post. So Jean served in the Fulda Gap, on the same post as John. I actually called a medical professional that worked with her back in those days on our post, and he said that Jean was the favorite of the wives and the daughters, the dependents in our unit, that they really loved how she dealt with them. And so the one thing you can say about those children is that the whole family lived and breathed United States Army. And then I guess the other thing you can say about the generals is that in the Army, just like the NFL, there are coaching trees in the Army, and who you worked for and who they worked for. And so Creighton Abrams' sons, all general officers, all had, and 2 of them were armor officers, and Creighton Jr. was field artillery officer. But all of them influenced a lot of officers. John Abrams influenced me, for sure. More about that later. But what a remarkable family of dedication to the U.S.
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate their service. But I also want to call out, it's hard to become a general officer. It takes a lot of, there's some luck to it, but it takes a lot of hard work, right? It's a very difficult position to achieve.
Just having one general in the family would be hard. And they've got 4.
Right.
And 3 4-stars. I've met them all at one point or another, and they were all highly successful. More about that when we talk about Creighton Abrams' legacy toward the end here.
Okay. As getting back to Abrams' story, as tensions increased worldwide in the late 1930s, he continues his professional military training as the U.S. prepares for potential involvement in global conflict. Where was he assigned at the start of World War II?
So he went to 4th Armored Division, was activated at Camp Pine, New York. And so that's when he was volunteered for service in the Armored Corps. That's where he went at first. And picture this, they had about 3,600 troopers that showed up there in New York. And the whole division had 20 tanks for training, and his battalion had 1 2 tank. No main gun, no cannon, just machine guns. How do you train with that? So what Abrams did is he would put his troopers in Jeeps, little M51s, the whole crew in it, 2 guys in the front with the driver and the bow gunner, the TC, the loader, and the gunner in the back of the Jeep. and he would train platoon maneuver with his people loaded into jeeps. He then, in July 42, he took command of a company. 60 days later, he was made a lieutenant colonel and a battalion commander. So that shows how fast, that the force was increasing. September 42, they went to the Cumberland Mountains for training. Then they went out to the Desert Training Center in California that Patton had started. And then September 43, he officially became the commander of the 37th Tank Battalion. Christmas 43, he shipped out from Massachusetts to England. But the one thing that all his troopers remember, and when I was just rereading sources to prepare for this interview, I was having flashbacks. But the one thing that with his son, but Creighton Abrams was just a monster on tank gunnery. And he and his people in England, while they were training, broke all the division gunnery records. And he had devoted all kinds of innovative, unusual, outside the box ways to train gunnery. And I'm sitting there thinking, my God, that's his son, John. John did the same with our cavalry squadron and tank gunnery. The other thing Abrams did that, you talk about the art of command, is Abrams was always in the front on tank gunnery. And at the time, battalion commanders coming out of World War I were I'm in the headquarters, back in a trench with a radio or something. Abrams was in his own tank for the tank gunnery, and that has carried over in the Armored Corps. These days, battalion commanders, company commanders are the first ones downrange for gunnery. And a lot of that, emanates from the Abrams and his style.
Well, I like the innovation of it. I mean, when you say to me there's one battalion, and to me that's 500 troops, then there's one tank per battalion. When you show up for training, he's like, well, we can't just have the other, 495 people standing around. So he innovated with those Jeeps to figure out maneuvers and shooting and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, exactly. And his son did the same thing with us. Put on a big football field and lined, put on objectives there, practice maneuver. But this thing with Abrams innovating and finding, number one, to keep soldiers busy, but number two, to get meaningful training when you don't have the gas or the equipment. That is a true art form of command. And he was very good at that. Yep.
So, yeah, he's a tank officer in the 37th Tank Battalion within the 4th Armored Division. Which battles or which front was he involved in?
So he was on the Western Front, the U.S. operations, coming out of Normandy. It was basically Operation Cobra. And, I think the battle, he's remembered, we'll get into it here a bit, but he's remembered mainly for the relief of Bastogne. That got so much press. But for my money, the Battle of Ericourt is his finest hour. The Battle of Ericourt was the biggest tank battle on the Western Front in the history of the war. It doesn't get a lot of press. It kind of came at the end of the big sweep through France for Operation Cobra. So here's the situation that Abrams was in. They had just come about 500, 600 miles across France from Saint-Lô and from the Normandy bridgehead. They crossed the Moselle River by Nancy in France, and their goal was to try to get to the German Siegfried Line before it was occupied. Patton was going all out to get to the Siegfried Line quickly and get through it before it could be adequately defended. So they had crossed the Moselle by Nancy, south of Nancy, and they had established a penetration of the German defenses shaped like a thumb. And the 37th was at the tip of that thumb, just 60 miles from the Siegfried Line. Patton was so close he could taste it. And he was putting the spurs on 4th Armored to get out there. And so while 4th Armored was kind of in this thumb-shaped penetration, the Germans sent 2 Panzer brigades and the 11th Panzer Division to attack it, basically from all 3 directions on all sides of the thumb. Now, these Panzer brigades were just created in the late summer of 44, and the 11th Panzer Division was a full-strength Panzer Division. And so, here you are, your 4th Armored, you got 37th Tank out there, really only one combat command. He's got about 50 to 60 tanks at that point that are operational, Abrams does. And so your arrayed against you are about 250, 270 tanks. But the outcome of the battle, tactically, was a decisive victory for the Americans. The Germans lost a total of 79 tanks. Abrams' own battalion destroyed 55 of those tanks for a loss of 14. Now, these Panzer brigades had Mark IVs, one battalion, and one battalion of Panthers. So, most people would think, well, the Shermans have no hope, right? They were still mainly Sherman 75s. But there's an interesting thing that Abrams and his troopers did. First off, the Panther had very wide tracks on the tank. It was built mainly for the mud in Russia. So it's about twice as wide as the Sherman. So one thing that Abrams and his tankers would do would be to detrack or to bust the track on the Panthers. And that would make it stationary. The other thing, the other advantage that Abrams and his guys took advantage of was the Sherman had vertical stabilization on the main gun. Panthers and Mark IVs had no stabe on their cannons. And so...
What does that mean?
So the stabilization on the main gun means that when the tank is on the move, there's a gyro in the turret that keeps, even if the tank is going over rough ground, the vertical stabe keeps that gun tube level. And so the M4s with their 75s would maneuver and be shooting on the move. They get around to the flank of these disabled Panthers. And so it was very innovative. And, that scene in the movie Fury with Brad Pitt, where he's getting around the side of the German tank, very realistic. The other thing that Abrams identified was the turret traverse on the Sherman was twice as fast as it is on the Panther. So they could, you detract that Panther, you move around the flank, that Panther's going to have a hard time getting his gun around. And so Abrams was very good at that maneuver. It was a hard-fought battle. Different views. The Germans thought it was a success because the penetration stopped, but it stopped because Patton ran out of fuel. Eisenhower gave strategic priority in Montgomery. Patton had to stop everything, but the Germans thought they had won. But clearly, at the tactical point, Abrams and his boys just really tore up the Germans. And if I might, Art of Command, right, is the theme of this podcast.
It is.
Abrams wrote a letter to his wife after 4 days of vicious combat. And I think for any former commander or former leader, this when I read this, it gave me kind of chills here. And he was no sleep. He had seen his own people killed, wounded. They were maneuvering. I mean, when you look at the maps and the official Army histories, you can't describe it because there's arrows and maneuvers all over the place. Furious battle. So after it was done, here's what he wrote his wife. I am all right and still going on. My heart and soul have been torn and seared by so many things already, by losses, by frustrations, by errors. Things have been most pressing. The pace has been furious. The attack is ferocious. This over a period of weeks is fatiguing. I haven't had my clothes off. I haven't been dry. I haven't been warm, except for quick naps. I haven't slept for 2 weeks. There's no time to eat right. There's no time to think. It's attack, it's attack, it's attack. That's why I don't write more. That's why there's no rest. And that's why you get so tired and so weary that you almost don't care anymore. When things are that way, the men, God bless them, have got to be led. Someone has to be cheerful, confident, and intelligent. Someone has got to be first. I mean, that strikes through. That is the very essence of command.
That's a masterclass in command, and that was to his wife, but that could have been to like a graduating class at West Point.
Yes, exactly. And it's just that you feel for him. People forget it's easy to, well, with us 14 tanks as compared to the enemy 55 tanks, whatever. But in those 14 tanks are men. Most likely those are men, soldiers, not commissioned officers, maybe lieutenants, maybe captains that he knew very well, that he had been through a lot with already. And the hurt inside, but still he had the fortitude to continue to lead, be of good humor, be confident, and lead these guys. I mean, it's quite remarkable. The other thing that I thought was pretty cool is he came up with one of his famous sayings came out of this battle. And again, keeping his men in good spirits. And he said, during the middle of the fighting, the officers came in. They told him the enemy were all around. One brigade, Panzer Brigade on one side, another Panzer Brigade on the other side. And he says, "Well, they have us surrounded again. The poor, you know what?" That kind of deadpan humor. He also would talk for many years, including Korea, Vietnam, about the parable of the good sergeant. And that was his kind of foggy that time of year at Ericourt. One of his company commanders sent out a sergeant with 2 tanks to put out an outpost on a road while the rest of the tank company lagered up. And Abrams told the story that this tank section sergeant, he went out on his own, put 1 tank hidden in a barn and another off to the side in a haystack. He sent a soldier about 150 yards down the road with a telephone, a radio telephone, and the wire stretched out from the back of the Sherman to give a warning. And it was foggy. And so the guy called in. He says, "We've got tanks coming down the road, German tanks coming out of the fog." And the section sergeant had put his tanks at an angle where the German tanks could not give their frontal armor to both. And so this section and this sergeant wiped out 7 of the 10 enemy tanks on his own. But Abrams told that story to make the point, you talk about training, camouflage and concealment. You talk about security and posting an outpost. You talk about flanking fires. This sergeant really internalized all that. And Abrams thought that was the best example of good non-commissioned officer work he saw in the whole war.
Yeah, I love that. That's good stuff. Okay. So by the early years of World War II, Abrams has established himself as a skilled armor officer whose leadership in tank warfare would soon earn widespread recognition in combat. How integral was Abrams in the Battle of the Bulge and the relief efforts around the surrounded American forces in Bastogne?
Abrams is the best known figure, I think, in the entire Army, maybe except for Patton, on the relief of Bastogne. And so to set the stage, you had the Germans attacking through the Ardennes. They surrounded the 101st Airborne in Bastogne. They were totally surrounded. No ground supply, no supply of ammunition was available to them on the ground. And 4th Armored Division in Abrams' army was 120 miles away at the time. And his companies were all dispersed out to various infantry battalions at the time as they were continuing their move to the east. So on the 20th of December, Patton pulled them out. Abrams had to reassemble his companies into his battalion and then begin the march north. They covered about 100 miles in 15 hours of road marching. Now, this is in wintertime, and so these tanks have rubber track pads, and rubber on icy roads is not easy, right? It essentially turns a Sherman tank into a 40-ton hockey puck, right? And so trying to keep it on these country roads, and it was foggy and it was cold. And by the 23rd of December, they're about 15 miles out from Bastogne. And you have, in the 4th Armored Division, you have Combat Command A going down the middle, Combat Command B going down the right side, straight up due north to Bastogne, Combat Command R, which is where Abrams and his guys were supposedly recuperating after the Lorraine campaign, were in the reserve. They first ordered CCR, Combat Command R, with Abrams and an armored infantry battalion to the right side. Then they maneuvered him back to the left side of the division, which is just as complicated as a maneuver as they had moving north. So Abrams was on the left side of the division coming in from the southwest of Bastogne. The interesting part to me is that Abrams and his counterpart with the armored infantry battalion, lieutenant colonel, kind of had to agree on what they were going to do, right? And Abrams and the AIB commander, there was a village heavily defended called Cibray between them and Bastogne. And so the Combat Command R commander had ordered them to take Cibray as a precursor to getting into Bastogne. Well, Abrams, all across France, they'd always attacked the weak spot. And so he and the AIB commander decided to go up this lightly defended country road, disobeying the direct order of the CCR commander. So they get up to this village, it's got a few Volksgrenadiers in it, and Abrams gives a great call for fire to the artillery. He had a lot of artillery supporting him. And the call for fire was concentration number 9, play it soft, sweet, is what the radio trend. Quite different than a normal call for fire.
Right.
But what this exposes is in Germany, we had a tank platoon leader from the German World War II Tiger tank battalion come in to talk to us. His name was Dieter Yen, and we brought him down to our squadron to talk to our officers about for officer professional development. And we asked Dieter Yen, what's the difference between fighting the Russians and the Americans? And he said, well, on the Russian front, we'd get our Tigers on a low rise, and the tanks would come, and we just start at the front picking them off, and from the nearest to the farthest, because they kept coming. We got to the American front in 1944. The American tanks would come out of the wood line, and we'd start at the front, and we'd hit a few of the lead tanks, and often the rest of them would go back in the wood line, and we'd pop our hatches. These everything we heard about the Americans is true. They're not tough fighters. But then 10 minutes later, all heck would break loose. P-47s coming in, artillery rounds coming in, the whole world turned upside down. And that artillery, for Abrams and the P-47s played a big part. But I don't want to understate how much Abrams and his own battalion did. I mean, the tanks that they killed at Ericourt with those M4s was magnificent. Abrams himself, and he put his staff officers into tanks as well. So we had kind of a little headquarters platoon. They were great, tankers on their own. And Abrams, going into Bastogne, made what one of his officers says was the best tank shot that he saw during the entire scope of World War II when Abrams took out an anti-tank position. So, yeah, Abrams, they broke through this town on this lightly defended country road, got to Bastogne, and much to the elation of the 101st Airborne.
Yeah, and much to the chagrin of the Germans. Yeah, he's a colonel by the end of April 1945. Without getting too deep into his later assignments, what did he do in Korea and Vietnam?
So in Korea, he came over kind of at the end of the war. He worked on the staff of General Bruce Clark with I Corps. It had to be a little bit of a depressing environment with the war winding down. He then goes to War College. He wrote a paper at the War College, my alma mater, on firepower versus mobility. And his position was that we should decrease the number of tanks supporting infantry, increase the number of armored units in the Army, and create armored corps, as opposed to divisions that are kind of armored divisions that are kind of piecemealed out to the various infantry corps. And so then he goes to Vietnam. He was General Westmoreland's second in command for a couple years. And Abrams had such the reputation out of World War II. Westmoreland, I think, was his West Point classmate. Westmoreland oftentimes would defer to Abrams. And at the end of every meeting, he would turn and say, well, what do you think, Abe? He wanted to make sure he had Abrams' buy-in. And then Abrams took command himself. A lot of friction over some incidents with the CIA and special forces where Abrams stood his ground against Nixon, Alexander Haig, and Henry Kissinger on a couple issues. But it just shows that, what the man was made of.
Yeah, and he must have done an okay job with Nixon, because in 1972, he's made Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army by President Nixon and serves until his death in 1974. We've been talking about his legacy most of the episode. His work in World War II is phenomenal. He did some interesting things in Vietnam. What do you think his legacy is?
So, his legacy is so, tied to Bastogne. It'll always be tied to Bastogne. But to me, it's battalion commander, being in his tank, being in there with his guys. His tank was called Thunderbolt. He put the name on the side of his tanks, and he had 7 tanks. He's got a strong legacy at West Point. They have a Thunderbolt 7 tank outside of Abrams Gate at West Point, which is painted to be like his. The motto of the U.S. Army Armor School to this day is "Forge the Thunderbolt." And I know there are a lot of tank battalion commanders running around who use Thunderbolt 6 as their call sign. One thing that I saw, that surprised me is when Abrams made Chief of Staff of the Army, there was still the Women's Auxiliary Corps, separate completely from the Army. Abrams doubled and then doubled again the size of the Women's Army Corps from about 6,000 up to 50,000. And so he was the precursor to expanding the role of women and females in the Army that actually came in 1978. The other thing he did was kind of transition the Army to an all-volunteer force. He focused on armor and mobility and did a lot of things that were kind of the precursor to air-land battle, which was the prevailing way of warfare for Desert Storm and the Iraq War as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. On his World War II service, you think tank commanders, and you think, oh, Rommel and Patton and Guderian, and then Abrams, for whatever reason, maybe just because he wasn't a full general yet, he doesn't get the exposure that he should.
He doesn't. But I think again, if anyone wants to read about armored war, Rommel in North Africa was genius, to be sure. But Abrams at Ericourt, anybody that's interested in armored warfare, read about Ericourt and Abrams. He had an inferior tank in many ways, heavily outnumbered, maybe 4-1, tough terrain, and he still came out on top. It was a masterstroke of armored unit command.
Interesting. Yeah. So all my listeners, please check out that battle. And of course, the great Creighton Abrams. And yeah, Kris, this was phenomenal. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on here. I'm an avid listener of both your series.
Oh, I thank you very much. Yeah. For our listeners, we have a Patreon now. Please check out patreon.com/Generals of World War II. And of course, subscribe to us on Facebook, YouTube, and anywhere you hear podcasts. And we thank the great Colonel Kris Thompson for joining us. And we hope you come back soon.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.